My name's Jim Slaven and this is All Hail to the Pod. In this episode of the pod, we're looking at Scotland's shocking drug death record. Drug deaths in Scotland are 15 times the European average and 3.5 times the rate in England. This is not just a national disgrace, it is an international embarrassment. Michael Collins is an expert in drug policy, someone with international experience of implementing progressive change to drug laws and innovative solutions to political failures just like Scotland's. Michael is currently Strategic Policy and Planning Director at the offices of the State's Attorney for Baltimore City. Previously, he worked on drug policy in Washington DC with some of the most prominent politicians in America. So for this episode of the pod, I sat down with Michael to discuss Scotland's drug death crisis. Michael, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
And we're going to speak here about Scotland's drug crisis, and in particular the death by drugs crisis, the statistics that were announced just at the end of last year. But before we do, I wonder if we could maybe get a bit of your background. You're currently the Strategic Policy and Planning Director for the State's Attorney for Baltimore City. Mm-hmm. And you're obviously from Glasgow, as we'll tell you start speaking. So maybe could you give us a bit of your background, how you've ended up from Glasgow now with that job in Baltimore?
Yeah, I was born in Glasgow in the south side, grew up there, Celtic fan, went to Holyrood, secondary that a lot of people know. I think it's still might be the biggest school in Scotland. And I then went to Strathclyde University and studied French and Spanish. And part of that is like you go and do a year abroad. So I ended up doing a year in Paris and really enjoyed the experience living abroad. And I think when I was younger, a couple of times when the family had money, like my dad was a teacher, and when the family had money, maybe 3 or 4 times throughout my childhood, we went to Spain. And so I really enjoyed, going there, the sun, the swimming pool, the sea, and also just the whole, trying to speak Spanish and stuff like that with other kids. And so I think I sort of got like a thirst for languages and travel there. And then after I did the year in Paris, and then I came back and finished up at Strathclyde University, and then left Glasgow. Then I must have been, God, what age would I have been? Maybe like 22, 23, something like that. And so then I moved to Spain, and I was kind of just initially like teaching English, living just outside of Barcelona in a place called Tarragona. And then I met my now wife, Natanya, who also does a lot of work in harm reduction. And she and I then, she's from Atlanta in the US. So she and I lived in Madrid for a while. And then it was kind of funny because she was going to do a master's program in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University doing public health before she really got involved in Johns Hopkins. And, it's funny now with Brexit and everything, because I was quite naive about, I just sort of like moved to Spain and, as you used to be able to do, you could just pick up and leave and show up and get a social security number and then get a job. And I kind of was naive about that in America. And I thought like, I'll come with you to America. And then was applying for jobs and people were asking, have you got a visa? And I'm like, no, can you help me get a visa? And then I realized like it's quite strict in terms of entry here. And so we ended up, my wife and I went to Mexico. I had been, actually it's funny, I was working as a translator for a law firm in Madrid. And I actually used to do a lot of like football contracts, like Real Madrid and stuff like that was one of the clients. But I got quite bored of it. And so I was very interested in like politics and policy and change. And I had a lot of free time in the job. And so while my wife was kind of like applying to go to Johns Hopkins, I was, I kind of started doing a little bit more writing about politics and stuff like that. And it was around the time, it was like 2008, and me and my friend Paddy had sort of done a lot of back and forth about the financial crisis and stuff like that. And like, then when I was applying for jobs in America and being unsuccessful, one of the places was like, oh, you know, we have an office in Mexico. You know, if you're interested, you might want to volunteer there. So I kind of was volunteer translating for them, like documents about, articles rather about like US foreign policy in Latin America. And it was a woman called Laura Carlson, who's still a close friend of mine. You know, I was basically, you know, initially translating for her, then doing some research. It's quite a sort of like left wing, very critical of US foreign policy in Latin America. And then so when I was trying to figure out this like situation of like, how do I get to America? Natanya and I, my wife, my then girlfriend, decided like, let's take a year and go to Mexico and kind of figure things out there. And so I basically, you know, messaged this woman, Laura Carlson, in Mexico, and I was like, hey, you know, like I'm enjoying this work. Like if I came to Mexico, would there be a job for me? And she was like, I don't really have funding for a job, but maybe I could give you like a small stipend and you could stay in my art studio. And I was like, can my girlfriend come? And she was like, yeah, okay, yeah, sure. So that was it. We just kind of like picked up and left and went to Mexico. And at the time, you know, it was really like, as it is now, very sort of like ravaged by the drug war. And Laura Carlson was very critical about the US drug policy in Latin America and how they had sort of militarized places like Colombia and Mexico and Central America. And so I kind of like got to learn a little bit more about like US foreign policy in Latin America. And then I was really interested in foreign policy generally. And so partly as a way to kind of get into America, I was like, I went and applied to do a master's program in Washington, D.C., which is not far from Baltimore. So after we did a year in Mexico, and then I think it was 2010, the summer of 2010, I actually moved to Baltimore. And then I was kind of like commuting, it's about an hour away, Washington, D.C. I was commuting to Washington, D.C. And sort of going to like university there, doing the master's program. I did a lot of stuff around like foreign policy. It was funny because it was quite a sort of, it's one of those schools where there's the universities where there's a lot of kind of like celebrity professors, you know, former Obama administration guy, this, and former Bush administration guy, that, and they're quite sort of conservative, I would say, in terms of their approach to foreign policy. And I became pals with this like Norwegian guy, and we sort of had this like left-wing group that we organized speakers to come and talk about things. And we actually got Laura Carlson to come and talk about the drug war, but we talk about like alternatives to economics and stuff like that, because you're learning kind of like one sort of vision of like international trade and international economics there. But then I graduated and I kind of I was interested in I got very interested in US-Cuba relations and the embargo and stuff like that from my work with Laura Carlson. And so a lot of that is like different to Britain. Foreign policy in America, you get the White House and you got like the president, but you also get Congress, and Congress has a lot of influence over foreign policy. So I was like, oh, you know, I'm interested in going and working there. So I got an internship and I was in the office of a guy called Joe Crowley, who's a congressman from New York. His mother's from Belfast. He was a very nice guy, but the internship was like a total waste of time. Like they had me doing the most boring stuff, coffee and getting like one time I had to pick up the congressman's guitar and stuff like that from his car. It was very like, I was kind of like, I kind of feel like I'm maybe more qualified to do some serious things. And it was, but it was interesting to kind of learn a little bit about Congress and about how US foreign policy works. The guy, funnily enough, is now famous or infamous because he was the congressman who Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez beat. You know, he was the sort of big dog that she took down many years later. And so I had that experience, and then I was kind of like interested in like US foreign policy. I was interested in like domestic policy a bit more in the US, and then honestly came out of like Georgetown and really struggled to like find a job that I wanted. I kind of wanted to do something that was like, there's a lot of jobs like related to Congress, but a lot of them are like corporate lobbying jobs. And I wasn't really, you know, I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to kind of, I applied for different like human rights jobs and international relations jobs. And then eventually I saw a job at Drug Policy Alliance, which is like the largest organization in the country doing work to end the war on drugs. And they had a bit of foreign policy stuff, but it was like working with Congress. And so, yeah, I applied there and got the job. And yeah, I was there for 6 years. I mean, it totally changed my life, but it was a lot of working with and sort of lobbying members of Congress to end the war on drugs. So Drug Policy Alliance was and is one of the leading organizations legalizing marijuana. So legalizing marijuana was a big thing that I did. I helped with the campaign to legalize marijuana in Washington, D.C. that was successful in 2014. Sentencing reform, reducing harsh sentences for drug offences, harm reduction, like promoting public health approaches to drugs, especially in America, as like the kind of overdose crisis really took hold as a result of, opioids. And then I did a little bit of foreign policy, like every now and then, but I ended up getting more and more drawn into like the domestic policy side of things. And I really loved it. I mean, it was great. You kind of, at one point I was, going to the White House like once a week to talk during the Obama years to talk about sentencing reform and try and figure stuff out and strategize and all that sort of stuff. And then, you sort of have like a big impact on the conversation about drug policy nationally. It's a lot more difficult to actually get legislation passed, and that was one of my the more frustrating things I experienced. It was very difficult to get laws passed, and so then at one point, like we had my wife and I, like we had kids, and we had always talked about we were on car journeys and stuff like that. Like maybe we should do another trip abroad before the kids are too old and stuff like that. And we've got two girls, and so she applied for a scholarship. She as I said, she does like harm reduction work here in Baltimore, and she applied for a scholarship from the US government to be like, oh, let's look at how Barcelona approached their overdose crisis. And so I took a year out from Drug Policy Alliance. I went to Spain. I did a lot of writing about drug policy, but then I also was working kind of part-time almost for like a Spanish drug policy organization called ICERS, which does a lot of work on marijuana legalization, but also on like psychedelics and ayahuasca and stuff like that. It was really interesting. And I got to like go to the Spanish Parliament and speak about marijuana legalization in front of different Spanish politicians. Podemos, like the kind of left-wing party over there, had invited us to come and speak, and that was great. And so it was a really great experience. And I ended up writing a report, which I can talk about like how Spain approached their drug policy and how Barcelona was able to kind of affect change, even though the Madrid government opposed it. And then I came back, worked another year at Drug Policy Alliance, and then I was interested in doing something more local in Baltimore, where I had been living the whole time, basically. And so there's been a move around like progressive prosecutors. So prosecutors in America at the local level are often elected officials, and that comes with like a lot of discretion. Prosecutors make a lot of decisions about sentencing, types of charges, types of offences they pursue, how harsh is the penalty, bail, like it runs the gamut. And so they have a ton of power. And there was a lot of movement around getting progressive prosecutors in. It used to be, historically, and it still is, to be honest, like prosecutors have a kind of tough on crime mentality, and this was a movement to kind of go away from that. And so I ended up connecting with Marilyn Mosby, who is the lead prosecutor here in Baltimore. They call her the state's attorney, and she and I had worked together on a policy around marijuana, where she stopped prosecuting marijuana offences, and I spoke at an event. And then I was like, when it came to the summer, I was organising a hearing in Congress about marijuana legalisation and racial justice. We got her to come and speak. I helped, prep her and sat behind her during the hearing, and then we had a really good relationship, and she did a great job at the hearing. And then afterwards I kind of just talked to her about like, would be interested in coming and working for you. And then that was pretty much it. I started that job in 2019, like October of 2019. And the job is trying to like come up with policies that will reduce the prison population, stop people going into jail in the first place, come up with like progressive, reform-minded policies. And so, you know, I guess the two big things that we've done while I've been in the office are, at the start of COVID in March 2020, we stopped prosecuting a range of like low-level offences, drug possession, sex work, minor traffic offences. And then we just announced recently that we're making those policies permanent. And really those types of offences, and we're working with the police to stop the arrest as well. So it's kind of like full decriminalisation in Baltimore City, which is, you know, the city of the wire and the drug war, and very synonymous with that sort of approach to crime, zero tolerance and all that sort of stuff. So it's really been interesting, because what we discovered in the year that we stopped prosecuting those offences was that, you know, there was no public safety benefit of prosecuting those offences. Those people who we stopped prosecuting didn't end up in the criminal justice system. Like, they weren't going out and shooting somebody like a few days later after we didn't prosecute them. A lot of the prosecutions had very big racial disparities, a lot of people of colour. So we were able to stop some of that. And then also we were able to, you know, focus resources on like more serious offences. You know, Baltimore has a big murder rate, a lot of guns, a lot of gun violence. And so the idea is, can we shift away from like these low-level offences and concentrate on actual public safety issues? So that's been exciting. And then the other big policy that we did was, in December, we opened a sentencing review unit, which is aimed at, you know, getting individuals out of prison who are serving like extreme sentences. So maybe, you know, like a good example is, there was a woman who was involved in a robbery when she was like 17, and the partner was a kind of pretty coercive, kind of domestic violence type situation. She went along for the robbery, and you know, one of the guys in the shop was killed, and she was sentenced in like 1978 and was still in prison, you know, and she had been like the model prisoner and rehabilitated and all that sort of stuff. And so this unit is aimed at like people like that. Can we get people out who are otherwise going to die in prison, who've served enough time? They did something bad, they did something very serious, but like the length of the sentence is excessive. And so, yeah, we've got maybe like 4 or 5 people out already since December. You know, we're hopefully going to get some more out. You know, police reform is the other thing I'll mention, which is like a big debate here. Like, you know, as you see all the police killings, like my boss was, before I came on board, one of the few prosecutors to actually try and prosecute police officers and for killing a black individual. So that's some of the other stuff I do, but I really like it. It's good. It's very interesting. I'm learning a lot.
Yeah.
It's here for the foreseeable future, I think.
Sounds fascinating. Incredible sort of backstory and already work experience you've had. Maybe we could pursue some of that sort of policy innovation in regards to drugs in Scotland, just a little bit for our own. But could you maybe tell us, given your experience and where you are, give us a little bit of the history of war on drugs. You mentioned the war on drugs a couple of times. We hear that phrase a lot, the war on drugs. We hear it over, like a lot of things, if it happens in the States, we eventually hear it here as well. So people talk about the war on drugs in Scotland as well. I mean, if there is a war, we're losing it. If there is a war, the drug gangs are winning and the state's losing. But tell us a little bit about the history. I mean, we're talking about Nixon. That's the sort of era we're talking about, introducing.
Yeah, I think that's when it really stepped up. Nixon in the sort of late 60s, early 70s, when there was the official kind of declaration of the war on drugs. But I think, you know, the reality is that it had gone on for a while before that, and it's always been very racially motivated, right? Front and center was always, you know, incarcerating black people, right? If you look at the trajectory of, you know, like the civil rights movement in America, you know, you go from sort of like slavery to, you know, Reconstruction to kind of then also post World War II, the rise of like a civil rights movement and black people finally getting the right to vote, etc., etc. And boom, soon after that comes this other method for keeping the black man down, which is the war on drugs. And so, you know, it was all about locking people up for using drugs. It was all about very harsh sentences. It was all about, you know, mandatory minimums, like mandatory very long sentences for like people who sold drugs, for people who used drugs, really no treatment option, no sort of compassion at all. And so I think from like Ronald Reagan really stepped it up as well in terms of that approach. And actually, you know, Joe Biden, the now president, was very involved in sort of the architecture around the war on drugs. It was a very bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans sort of holding hands and saying we need to be tough on drugs. And yeah, that was this like heavy-handed approach that really led to this mass incarceration problem that the US has, where I think they have 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. More people under lock and key now than were ever slaves. You know, some real horrifying statistics, and it's you know, it's the number of people, it's the length of time, it's the type of offences that people go away for, all those things, and the kind of you know, at the heart of it is racism and a racially biased approach to, you know, enforcing these laws, which for most people I think would agree was you know, the intent all along. I think Michelle Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, where she talked about this is kind of, as I said, part of the trajectory of, you know, keeping people of color down. And obviously now, you know, as I mentioned before, you know, the US exported this model to other countries, and you know, it's very damaging in places like Mexico and Central America. And you know, you also see that tough on crime approach being replicated in the UK, right? And kind of, at least when Tony Blair took power, like part of his approach was like tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, this idea that like zero tolerance was the right approach. And that was really like imported from the US, from, you know, Rudy Giuliani and New York and places like that, where they were like, this is something that will win us votes with like white middle class people, and to hell with the consequences, you know. But, you know, we're living with the consequences now, and you see even, you know, the tension between police and communities of color that plays out, you know, almost every week now. It feels like there's an incident, there's another incident in Minnesota this week. But the way, you know, it's not the case that drugs and the drug war are the only reason why people are incarcerated, or even like the main reason per se, but drugs always give people a reason to stop an individual, to harass them, to arrest them, to incarcerate them, to, you know, and it's that system of punishment where even when you do the time and come out of jail, it becomes difficult to get a job, it becomes difficult to get housing, education. Like, it's just this system of like continual punishment that really falls on the backs of people of colour in this country.
And could we maybe then, moving it forward to now, I think most people in the UK would be familiar with the sort of opioids epidemic in the States, and certainly myself, seen a couple of documentaries, read a couple of books that have touched on it, and it really is like a horrendous situation. A lot of them prescribed drugs, big pharma, the big pharmaceutical companies making absolutely insane amounts of profit on the back of it. But I seen you'd said something which was quite interesting, and it stuck with me, which was that there was a lot of sympathy for these communities and for the people who had these drug problems, and they were rural, mostly white working class communities. So people had sympathy for them and wanted to give them hugs. But you made the point that when the heroin epidemics was going through the sort of inner city, the big urban areas, mostly black communities, they didn't get hugs, they got handcuffs. And that stuck with me because it made me have to think myself, because when I had watched things on opioids scandal, I had felt sympathy for the people involved, and I had to then think, well, is that because they're white or what's? So could you maybe just say a little bit about that, because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's if you go back to like the 1980s when there was a crack epidemic in the country, you know, there was, just like I said, it was the crack epidemic mostly, you know, impacted communities, black communities in America, places like Baltimore, places like Chicago, New York. And the approach then politically was this like heavy-handed, like let's just get them off the streets, lock them up. Even drug users, people going away. I mean, there was until very recently in the US, 100-to-1 difference in crack cocaine and powder cocaine sentencing. Right, powder cocaine, obviously, the white guys in Wall Street are using it. It's the same drug, crack cocaine. It's just different formulation. But it wasn't based in science. It was just like you get 100 times heavier sentence for selling crack cocaine, and that is like a very good example of like the racial disparities. The media really hyped it up in terms of, I mean, you're talking about watching documentaries, but like the media coverage of these issues in the 80s talk about crack babies and zombies, and I'm not saying that it wasn't a problem or anything like that, but just the approach was completely different to the opioid epidemic, which the classic story is like the sort of high school athlete who is great at basketball and then injures their ankle, and then they start taking this pain medication, and then they move on to heroin and fentanyl and stuff like that. And that's been the image, contrasting with like the crack baby zombie image. And so that person is white, usually in the opioid epidemic's case, and so there's like more sympathy. And even the kind of I was there during this like mind shift where you saw Republicans from very rural states like Iowa and West Virginia and Kentucky be like, you know what, man, maybe we need to stop punishing these people, and maybe they need more treatment and support and stuff like that. And it was totally because of race. It was totally because they were like, actually, this isn't somebody in like some city like Chicago that I never see. This is actually like one of my friends, daughter or something like that, and a lot of people were getting right, and it sort of like, it did change people's, and look, it was a good thing that it happened that way, but I think we need to be honest and say, like, this is why this is happening, because the war on drugs is racist, and this is just like another example of that. The fact that we've shifted to a more compassionate approach in this country when it comes to drug users is because of the sort of perception that of who is using the drugs, not any other real change in terms of research or policy or any breakthrough. It's totally connected with racism.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And since I heard you saying that, have you noticed it much more? You notice politicians talking in very different terms about the opioids, and you can notice as well it is rural, white, mostly white working class people, as opposed to the sort of inner city situation in big cities like Chicago. And so you do notice it very much. But tell me this then: if the war on drugs in the United States is a war on people of colour, that can't be said about Scotland. I mean, it might be different bits of UK, but certainly in Scotland, I think that's one of the things that can't be read over. But is it possible to look at it in terms of class, that it's a war on the poor?
Definitely, it is. It's absolutely. And look, it's class here as well, right? I mean, I think, I don't want to say it's only black people. White people are arrested, go to prison, as well. But it's always a class issue, right? That is one dominant theme that would link the drug war, regardless of country, right? Whether it's in Mexico or whether it's America, whether it's Glasgow. The people who are impacted are often the working class, the lower class individuals who don't have the resources to fight back, whether it's fight back legally or whether it's get connected to treatment or whatever. And they're the kind of they're ostracized, they're forgotten about, they're isolated within society. They don't have the voice, or the perception on the part of politicians is they don't have the voice. And so, they get that raw deal, which is the drug war. And yeah, I mean, look, you definitely, like, growing up in Glasgow, you knew, the neighbourhoods that struggled the most with drug use were often the neighbourhoods that had the highest rates of poverty. There's an inextricable link there. And I think the way in which successive governments in Scotland and in the UK generally have both, what allows Tony Blair to stand up and say, I'm going to be tough on crime, is because his base, the white middle class voters and the Conservatives that he's trying to win over to get into power in like 1997, are like, yep, that's not me, right? They're like, yeah, I'll vote for that because that's that other guy, and that's the like the working class guy that he didn't need their support, or he already had their support in some other ways, and so they were able to, and that's what's led to this, I think, to this situation now where people in Scotland, and I think it's a good thing, the politicians in Scotland are really waking up to like this tragedy and this national embarrassment in terms of like the mortality rate for drugs in Scotland, because I think, and that's what kind of like struck me. I'm out in America. When you're in America, right, as somebody from Scotland, I'm very proud to be from Scotland, right? And I mean, people might say my accent's changed, but I've tried, I've tried to remain sort of faithful, if you like, and true to kind of like, and I say still a Celtic fan and keep in touch with all my pals in Scotland and go back at least once a year, at least pre-COVID. But it's Scotland is kind of like, it's seen, especially in the last 10, 15 years, as this like modern kind of sort of social justice society, right? They look at all the women's rights and human rights, and and I think that is completely like undercut by these statistics on drugs. A lot of people like, Scotland, really, what happened there? And I'm like, I know, it's because it's worse than America, like per capita, worse than America.
We should just give people some of the statistics here. I mean, the last year that we have the stats for, there's like, it's 1,264 people died through drug deaths. Now that's more than 3.5 times the number in England and Wales. I mean, it's to put it into perspective for people so they see how much worse it is than everywhere else. That's 295 per million. The next worst country is Sweden with 81 per million. The UK on average is 76. And the death rate in Scotland is 15 times the European average. I mean, we aren't even close to anyone else.
Yeah.
It's horrendous. As you say, it's worse than the United States. So tell me, with your experience and working with this as you are every day, what do you make of that? I mean, how is it? It is an embarrassment. How does it go so bad?
I honestly, I mean, there's so many reasons, but I think there's a perception of, there's a sense rather that people were asleep at the wheel, right? When it comes to, I don't know, or I don't think that from everything I heard, drug policy was ever a top priority for, the SNP or a lot of the other parties. I think it's now slowly they're waking up to this idea, like, oh shit, we really get on top of this, and the numbers keep going up, and they brought in a new drugs minister and all that sort of stuff. But I think, I mean, they admit themselves that they've mishandled this situation. The question is, why did it happen? And I think, again, it goes back to like, who is dying, right? If it was, Alex Salmon's son or Nicola Sturgeon's sister or something like that, and those types of people, then I think it would have become an emergency a lot sooner than now. But I think it's because it's like homeless people, and because of the stigma attached to drug use in the country, these people are seen as, quote unquote junkies and like scumbags and, BAMs and Neds, and like, we don't really, the dregs of society. And that attitude has, I think, permeated policy making in Scotland. I think it's meant that people could just ignore these problems until, we're at this point where it's almost too late, right? And I think, look, there's people that are trying very like innovative approaches and almost embarrassing the government themselves. Like Peter Crikant in Glasgow, what he's doing is he's essentially said, the government is not doing anything about this. They're too slow. I'm going to take the law into my own hands. If you want to arrest me, for allowing drug users a safe place to use drugs, a safe consumption space, which is an almost universally accepted intervention, then I'll go to jail for that. And it's put the government in a box, because it's like, he's doing this. He's an ordinary guy with a big heart. Like, what's wrong with you guys? What's taking you? And I think like that's like a sad indictment of where Scottish politics and Scottish politicians, Scottish law enforcement as well, a lot of responsibility there, Scottish prosecutors, There's a lot of blame to go around in terms of how we arrived at this situation. But, I'm not confident that the political courage exists to do what I think has to be done in Scotland to get them out of this mess. I think there's still a lot of I think there's some wishful thinking. Like, hopefully this will just die down and we can go back to talking about independence or whatever,
Well, just to sort of to back that up, in recent days, I was reading a few, because the election's on, so Drugs Has came up, and the government said, give another £250 million, which presumably will just go to charities that are already get some more money. And they've said, maybe we took our eye off the wheel a bit, we should focus on it. But I mean, when I was reading through the responses for the Scottish government, politicians, or the Scottish government's drug task force, they seem to be saying that in Scotland it was a unique combination of events that meant the stats were so bad. But the factors they were highlighting were social deprivation, long-term drug use of individuals, and stigma for accessing services. But they can't be unique, even all put together. I mean, that can't be unique to Scotland. That must exist. That combination of factors must exist in England, in Ireland, and other European countries. So it seemed to me that even months after these stats had been released and people had been shocked at the data, they still were just saying the same things they'd been saying for years, that actually it was just about these different things, and almost hoping in some way that they'll stumble across a solution to bring these statistics down, rather than actually looking at some of the policy innovation that you've been talking about.
Yeah, and look, I mean, I have had conversations. I mean, I wrote something, I think in December or something like that, about the drug deaths and what I thought needed to happen. And then that did trigger some outreach from the Scottish government about, their policies and what they're planning on doing. And I do think there's some smart people there that are really committed to getting this done. I do also think that there's some big obstacles that people at the lower level in government are not going to be able to overcome. In other words, you really need somebody to spend some political capital here, like Nicola Sturgeon, if as seemed likely, SNP get back into power, right? And I think that's the question for me. Like, I think I've said, and what I said in this article was, like, Scotland just has to, like, do what Peter Crikent's doing effectively. Like, they just have to, enact the policies that they think are the right policies. And if London and Westminster or like the British government want to sue them and take them to court, have that fight. I think what has been very disappointing is, like, I don't think SNP are, known for backing down from fights with Westminster and the Tory government and Boris Johnson and whoever else about any policy. But on drugs, they're kind of like, well, we can't do this because, we don't have the powers, or like, we can't do this because Boris Johnson says we can't, and we're going to ask him for the powers. And it's like, while you're doing all that faffing about, people are dying, right? And I think the good thing about Scotland is, I think most of the major parties and major players, and even the media, like the Daily Record and stuff like that, do have a good sense of what needs to happen. Like, the debate is not really about the policy solutions themselves. I think the debate is, like, how do we get from, like, this place to this place? How do we get from, like, the sort of, like, start to finish? And the reality of the situation is that I don't know if there's, like, political will to take on Westminster on this issue, right? To dare them to be like, we're opening a safe consumption space. Do what you got to do. Take us to the Supreme Court or whatever. I don't know that. I don't know that the political will exists to take on the prosecutor establishment in Scotland, the Procurator Fiscal, and those guys who are very resistant to, allowing even something like drug use to be decriminalised, and like, I don't know that the political will exists there. That is what needs to happen. You need to have, I mean, it's an absolute embarrassment. It's devastating. It's tragic. You need bold action. So you need to be bold. And I think for me, the bold action means doing, what I said, taking on Westminster and basically saying, that we should, taking on Westminster and basically saying that we should we're going to pursue these policies. We're going to open safe consumption spaces. We're going to decriminalize drug possession. And if you don't like it, like, we'll see you in court effectively. But I don't know that that's going to happen.
Well, and one of the other interesting things, when these statistics were released at the end of last year, there was such an outcry that the minister responsible was sacked.
Yep.
I can't remember if he was sacked or resigned, but he was gone. And they put a new minister in, Angela Constance. And I remember one of the very first things she said was, and I thought both aspects of it were interesting, that she said that they would follow evidence-based policies and also work within what powers they had. So there was immediately, although there was a change of personnel, they were essentially just going to be pursuing the same strategy, in the sense that they weren't going to challenge Westminster, they weren't going to deviate. As you say, they challenge Westminster on almost everything every day of the week. So it seems odd that they didn't on this. But also this evidence-based, I mean, the notion that politicians follow things based on evidence. I mean, they follow opinion polls, they follow elections, they follow whatever to get themselves re-elected. The idea that they're all about evidence is a nonsense. If they were about evidence, they would be doing a hell of a lot more about inequality or about loads of other things that are all around about us. So, I mean, what do we make of that when they have a new person come in, but they say essentially the same as the old guy, and it's created this absolute crisis and national embarrassment?
Yeah, well, I did meet with Angela Constance, I think in February, to talk about like what some of my thoughts are, and we kind of had it was a good conversation. I do think you rub up against these like constitutional barriers, right? The thing I try to point out to Angela Constance and to other members of the Scottish government is that, when you're in Scotland, right, there's this kind of mentality of like, we're in this unique situation because, London has all the power, and what can you do? We'll try and do everything else but take on Westminster. And the history of drug policy reform internationally is that you do have central governments who are very slow to act and are often the last people to act, but local jurisdictions, or like the kind of the local government, if you like, is often the one that's like, we're going to do this anyway. And so in America, right, we've got marijuana legalization in something like 16 states. It's still illegal at the federal level, but what happened was states were basically like, we're going to put this to the voters, and if the voters decide to legalize marijuana, we're going to do it. You got this big industry. It's all technically like illegal at the federal level, but they've gone ahead and done it anyway. They've kind of done the better to ask, forgiveness than permission. And, there's no way marijuana legalization is going back now. You have the same debates here about like safe consumption spaces and drug checking and other services, right? It wasn't like Barack Obama said, like, I want to legalize marijuana, let's make it happen. And everybody was like, all right, I guess. It was more the sort of like grassroots pushing local governments. The same in Spain. In Barcelona, they had, or in Catalonia generally, they had a real big heroin problem in the late 1980s, early 90s, right? And the Madrid government was dragging their feet. And so the local government was like, you know what, we're going to open safe consumption spaces. We're going to give methadone, take-home methadone. We're going to, allow syringe programs, like all that sort of stuff. They have cannabis clubs in Barcelona and throughout Catalonia. And all that stuff exists in this kind of like legal grey area, because the Madrid government on stuff like cannabis clubs have like challenged them, said like, oh no, you can't do that. And so this push and pull always exists in drug policy between the sort of smaller local government, if you like, and the national central government, or the sort of autonomous regions in Spain versus like the central Madrid government. That is the same dynamic in Scotland, right? You have like the Scottish government that wants to do something on drug policy, and London is saying no. So the solution is to, for me, my point of view is just go ahead and do it, right? Just go ahead and do it and deal with the consequences, because I do think there's public support for these kind of things. I do think, it's just like, the thing that I think is frustrating for me is like, it makes policy sense to do that. It also makes political sense, like let Boris Johnson come in and take away this life-saving, scientific, evidence-based intervention like safe consumption spaces. Let it be in his watch that overdose deaths continue to climb. But, right now it's just, they're just kind of like, we can't do. And again, they're getting legal advice around these issues, and I'm sympathetic to that. But at some point, you have to do what's right. And again, that's what Peter Krykant's doing. It's like civil disobedience. That's how what he is doing is a kind of microcosm of what I am suggesting. Just take matters into your own hand, just do it and deal with the consequences. I think what Peter Krykant is doing is exists in that legal grey area, but he's showing up the Scottish government, because they're not, and I don't want them to, but they're not, the police aren't arresting him, and they're not, I think he's running for parliament just now,
Yeah, he is.
He's sort of got local support and media support, and so one thing is the law, right, and then the other is what is right and what is needed to save lives. And I think just now, like, the government, for whatever reason, is sticking very closely to what is legally the right thing to do. But you got to have courage to do the right thing, even if it is legally challenging, even if it's politically challenging. And I think that's the kind of impasse, the dead end that Scotland is at just now, because I don't know that the SNP are willing to face down Westminster on this specific issue.
And the other thing, I suppose, short of facing down Westminster in that way, the Lord Advocate sits in the SNP cabinet. He's in charge of the prosecuting service. Presumably they could do a lot more by way of discretion than they are. So even if they say, it's because we didn't have the powers and it's all Westminster's fault, that doesn't explain why they didn't have some discretionary powers enforced even just at the prosecutor level, which would alleviate some of these drug deaths.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, that's why I said before, there's a lot of blame to go around, and there's an establishment within the Procurator Fiscal, the Lord Advocate, that kind of the prosecutor's office, where they are resisting these changes. And it's going to take somebody like Nicola Sturgeon to say, like, no, I don't care. He's in the cabinet. You do what I say. We're doing this, and we're moving ahead with this. Because you could make drug possession a lowest enforcement priority. You could make it, a civil fine akin to what often happens, at least my understanding, in Scotland with cannabis possession. But there's just kind of like, even like, I think what is very stupid about like the Scottish system is that police don't even have the ability to divert. They have to arrest. So if they pick somebody up for possession, the ultimate decision is made by the prosecutor. And if you think about like the life of like a drug user, by the time it can be quite chaotic, right? And you're going to get arrested, you might get held, you're told to show up to court, all this sort of stuff. And then eventually you might get diverted, versus like me, an officer on the street, can say to somebody like, hey, listen, you want me to take you down to the treatment centre? Or you need this. That is how it's done here, right? We don't really, we do get involved in diversion, but there's police-led diversion, because that like the police are on the streets, they know these people, they see them quite often, they can hopefully assist them. But you've got this sort of strange setup where like prosecutors are the only people allowed to make a decision about diversion, and that's that is a legal change that is small, that's fundamental, but hasn't happened yet, and I don't know that it will happen. But yeah, that speaks to kind of like some of the internal resistance that I think even the SNP and Scottish government are facing from prosecutors.
And I think just as we wind up, it seems to me that if I was to go out in the working class area that I live in or that I work in, and you have this conversation with people, and people talk about drugs all the time because it's a big issue. But if you were to speak to them specifically about decriminalization, about diversion, about challenging Westminster, about being innovative in policy, I think in regards to the people in our community who have got drug problems, who are caught with possession of drugs, whatever it is, people would support that. It would be a popular move to try and make these steps. But of course, the Lord Advocate and the politicians and government, they don't live in our communities, they live somewhere else. But what I would say is...
It goes back to the class issue that you will...
Absolutely. Absolutely, and that is definitely an issue. I think that none of the politicians live here, so they haven't got a feel for what they're assuming what's popular and no popular, in the sense that they think everybody wants people to be tough on drugs. And I mean,
Yeah.
but what I would say is, see, in the community I live in, one of the big problems people have is they do wonder why there isn't any action getting taken on drug gangs, on the people importing the drugs, manufacturing the drugs. How have they never? So if ever there is police action, it is targeting drug users. It's targeting people at the lowest level. And the dogs on the street know who the drug gangs are, and know who's importing it, they know the front businesses and the community projects that are using their money and all the rest of it. So people do have a sort of question, well, why has nothing been done about that? So the war on drugs isn't working on any level.
Yeah, and I've looked at the data in terms of like arrest numbers in Scotland and for drugs, and the majority of them are for possession.
Yeah.
The majority of them are for cannabis, right? Not the drug that's killing people. And then you sort of wonder, like, why is that? Like, and I think, and why are the police and prosecutors resistant to change? And my experience here in America, and I think that, you know, you can extrapolate that to police and prosecutors in Scotland, is that making drug arrests is one of the, you know, easiest types of arrests in prosecution, right? You smell the marijuana, you search the person, you got the drugs. It's normally like a non-violent individual. It's a very easy arrest to make, and so much of police and prosecution isn't necessarily about improving public safety. It's about statistics, right? And so if you can show, well, you know, we made, you know, 1,000 arrests yesterday, 1,000 drug arrests, like, it sounds good, right? But then you look at the quality and the types of investigations and arrests and the resources that are going. I mean, so much of policing is stats driven. And so if you're a police chief and you say to your rank and file, right, I need you to go out, you know, and we need to make 100 more arrests today, they're not going to do the high profile sting that might interrupt the supply of drugs. They're going to just go roll up on the corner, grab a bunch of people and bring them downtown, and that's that. They've got their numbers up. And so when you try and change, you know, you try and change that, you're effectively making their job more difficult, right? And, you know, it's funny, like working on something like marijuana legalization. Even I worked in medical marijuana for years, and people would say to me, like, oh, I bet the big pharmaceutical companies are really a problem for you and your lobbying. And honestly, the main organizations that resisted us every step of the way on harm reduction, on sentencing, on marijuana legalization were police groups. It was always police and prosecutor groups, district attorney association, blah, 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 because they want to keep control. They want to keep that decision making. They want the discretion themselves. They want the power. They want the funding. You know, let's be honest about this, right? If you're not making drug possession arrests, right, you know, maybe we change your funding structure, right? All those kind of things are, you know, interwoven and lead to. And look, you know, I think like police and prosecutors often have very sort of like moralistic, almost religious views on good and evil. You know, drugs are bad. People use drugs are bad, and so all these factors contribute to a situation where these bureaucracies, be they police or prosecutors, just become very, very resistant to change.
Yeah. And well, there's no any question that'll be a factor in Scotland, because the formation of Police Scotland, the one unified force across the whole country, they have got massive power and practically no transparency or accountability. It really is it's a bad situation, policing, I think, generally, but I think with this question of drugs, and because drugs obviously it seeps into a whole load of other issues as well. There's no question the police will be a big player. So if they're no keen on change, that'll be partly why the Scottish government aren't really forcing any change. Final question though for you, which feeds into that, which you're somebody who's all about getting action, as in policy, innovation, law changes, rather than the nice conversations you might have with sort of government ministers, politicians, and we'd all sit down and have a pleasant conversation about it. But how do we actually create change? What is it listeners could do who are living in communities that are really struggling with the drugs issue, didn't really see any improvement? In fact, it's getting worse. what could people do to try and implement some sort of pressure on the government to see some of these sensible changes?
It's funny because I've done advocacy like over 10 years, and there's lots of like different tools like petitions and meetings with legislators and, marches and stuff like that. The most effective tool for politicians is the media. That's what they pay the most attention to. Most politicians are media obsessed, right? And so, I wrote the article in the Times, right? I could have gone and, I knew what I was doing because I was like, I want to provoke a debate and provoke a conversation. And then, you get the outreach from the government. Oh, can we talk to you? Can we meet you? Politicians, even more than like a one-on-one meeting, when they're like in the media, they care about their image, they care about their reputation because they want to get re-elected, they want to climb the ladder. And so writing like opinion pieces, letters to the editor, publishing what you're trying to do, it's going to reach a bigger audience, right? And then, these politicians have like Google alerts with their names, right? So it comes up every day, like, oh, Michael, like that. They got whole media teams and stuff like that, like tracking all this stuff. And the last thing they want is anything bad to be said about them. So if you're in a place where you feel your MP is not doing the right things or not saying the right things, I name names right in there. John Smith, my MP, I need him to, support safe consumption spaces, and here's why, and all that sort of stuff. Like, and then get it published in the newspaper or write it in a letter to the editor and all that sort of stuff. You'll see that is like a very, very effective tool. Because we're out, when you're for good or for bad, we're in this very sort of media obsessed, media conscious environment, and politicians more than anybody are media obsessed.
Well, and sadly in Scotland, everything is seen through the prism of the national question, the independence, will there be a referendum or no? But I think the drugs death stats are so bad, it's such a national embarrassment, but hopefully we can maintain some pressure on that and see some change. Michael,
no, definitely.
Thanks for joining us. Been excellent. Thank you very much. Enjoy Baltimore.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers. And thanks for listening. All Hail to the Pod is produced by Cowgate Media. For more information on this and other episodes, follow All Hail to the Pod on social media or visit 107cowgate.com.